Hello, my name is Marcia Grigsby and I am a member of Riverside First Church of God. I decided a couple of years ago that we needed to do some research with our history of our church, and it became a real passion for me to do this. And in order to do the research, it involved talking to people in our church who have been here for quite a while. I also went through old church documents. I went on to Ancestry.com. I looked through newspaper clippings. And I also, Anderson Church of God puts out a yearbook. And so I went through that because I could access that online. So hopefully the information I have is accurate. The Church of God has offices in Anderson, Indiana, and they began in 1881. It started as a movement waving the banner of salvation in Christ alone, the unity of the believers, the holiness of God's people, and salvation. We are a part of the Anderson, Indiana Church of God. There are others in the United States, but they're different. Daniel Warner was among those who started the movement. He is also referred to as D.S. Warner. It was put upon his heart and other founders that churches had become man-made and man-run institutions. He felt that the church had gotten away from the simple teachings of the Bible with Jesus as head of the church. He became the center of controversy because of his preaching about the holiness, about salvation through Jesus Christ, the unity of the believers, and sanctification. He attended a fellowship in Ohio, and he was admonished there, and they told him to stop what he was preaching about. They did not agree with him. He refused to stop, and he was expelled from that fellowship. So he went to Indiana, and his work there formalized the Church of God in Anderson, Indiana. He traveled and evangelized and led camp meetings in several states and even into Canada. He told people to come out of Babylon, which meant to worship together rather than being separated by creeds, doctrines, and dogmas that were man-made. They were known as the come-outers. This is not a new denomination. This is a movement to restore central Bible truth that all must be born again to be a part of the church. We are not voted in. Jesus makes us a member. I'm a person who is very into data and numbers. Always have been. So I'm going to give you some numbers that tie into our church here. Our church began in 1914, so therefore it is 106 years old. We've had 4 buildings, 15 pastors, 2 have retired while they were pastors here. One of our pastors died while he was serving as a pastor of our church. One was a woman, 14 were married, 1 was single, and we've had 3 assistant pastors. In 1914, a group of people met in a little hall, led by the leadership of Thomas Bowie, who was a manager and salesman for Singer sewing machines, and Leonard Crawford, who was a postal worker. At that time, we were also affiliated with Anderson, Indiana. Amy Sullivan was the only female pastor. She was born on Ferry Road, which is in Stafford County, in 1906. She never married. She became the pastor of the church in 1929. In 1930, the church acquired a building on Ferry Road where services were held. In 1932, the congregation moved into a basement on Lafayette Boulevard, which is in the city of Fredericksburg. And it was a basement. It had a roof on it, a flat roof on it, and that was all. They became known as the Fredericksburg First Church of God. She stepped down as pastor, but remained active in the church until her death in 1973. Albert Liddick was the next pastor of our church. He came from Pennsylvania. In 1933, he had come to Fredericksburg for a church convention, where he had been invited to speak. They offered him the position as pastor of Fredericksburg First Church of God. He had to think about it because, for one thing, the pay was less than what he was making in Pennsylvania. But he decided to accept it. He came to Fredericksburg with his wife and 3 children. And on the way down, the truck that was carrying their furniture was in a wreck, and so they lost all of their furniture. Also, when they arrived in Fredericksburg, the house that they were supposed to live in, the people that owned the home did not know that Pastor Liddick had children, and so they refused to rent it to him. So there was a lady in the congregation, her name was Evelyn Wanger, and she opened up her home to Pastor Liddick and his family until they could find somewhere else to live. Pastor Liddick is now starting with a small group of people with no building. He was the pastor of this church from 1933 until 1977, with a few breaks in between. Over on the boulevard, they completed the level above the basement in 1938. They didn't take out a loan for this. They all worked together. They put their money together. The children would sell pencils and candy in order to put money into the building fund as far as what they could do. And the labor of the church came from the people within the church. They even built the pews that were used in the sanctuary down in the basement and then carried them up for the sanctuary. The building still stands today and is where the Salvation Army is. Pastor Liddick decided that he would retire in 1963. He's now been pastor of this group of people for 30 years. After he leaves, a few things happened in the church, and about 30 people left Fredericksburg First Church of God. And they asked Brother Liddick if he would meet with them. They put their money together and rented a building to hold their Sunday worship services. Pastor Liddick became their spiritual leader again, and he took no money and no expense from them. Here he is again with a small group of people and no building again, and some of the same people. But in 1965, they had saved and donated enough money to purchase 4 lots on Stafford Avenue. In 1967, they needed to borrow money from a bank. They needed $25,000 because they were planning now to build a building on those 4 lots. 2 banks turned them down. The third bank said yes, but we need $100,000 in collateral. So the members of the church put up their homes for collateral so that they could get this bank note for $25,000. Pastor Liddick was one, and also Evelyn Wanger was another one, and then there were others. January 7th, 1968, the building was dedicated. Now they have about 100 members. There was a 10-year note, and it was paid off in 3 years. They could not name their new church the Fredericksburg First Church of God because that church was still in existence over on the boulevard. So they named it Arwood Church of God. They named it after a woman in the congregation. She was the one who gave the first sizable donation to purchase the 4 lots on Stafford Avenue. Her name was Laura Tyler Arwood. In 1972, the trustees at the church on Lafayette Boulevard told Brother Liddick that they wanted to turn the building over to Arwood. They felt as though it belonged to the people there. Their church was no longer worshiping there. It had disbanded. And so the building was turned over to Arwood, and they sold it to the Salvation Army, who's still there today. In 1975, Tick Bourne became the assistant pastor. And later in 1975, Brother Liddick retired again. Tick became voted in as the pastor, and then he resigned in 1977. Well, Brother Liddick came back, and now he is filling in as a pastor until they can find a full-time pastor for the church. So he now has been pastor for 44 years. In 1977, they hired Brother Beck, who was from Northern Virginia. Under his leadership, the congregation grew, many souls were saved, an addition was put onto the church, and the 10 acres that our building stands on today was purchased. When it was just a piece of property to us, just with land and a big field, they built a pavilion on the back part of it, and people donated their labor and they donated the materials. So really it didn't cost the church a lot of money to do that. We held church picnics here, there were ball games, we had revivals, sunrise services, and even on Sunday mornings, the people who were in charge of our children, working with our children, would put the children into the church van and bring them out here for their devotions and their church lessons, and then they would play games with them and then take them back to the church so that their parents could take them home. We didn't do that every Sunday, but it happened often enough where the children really enjoyed it. We voted in an assistant pastor, Jack Reedy. And then Brother Ed resigned in 1988, and so Jack Reedy then became voted in as our pastor. He stayed for a couple of years, resigned, and the church hired Brother Robbie Spencer from Kentucky. We knew Ben Spencer, his father, and his mother, Mary. Ben had held several revivals at our church. And in 1992, Brother Robbie accepted the position as pastor of the church. Eventually, he left the church, and eventually he moved back to East Campbellsville, Kentucky, and took over his father's church when his father retired. Unfortunately, Brother Robbie passed away at a young age of 52 in 2018 after a lengthy battle with cancer. The church in 1997, when Pastor Robbie left our church, hired Pastor Rick Mooney to become the pastor. He accepted the call. He truly loved people and he loved the Lord. The church was hurting. They had lost lots of pastors in a very short amount of time. They began to heal under his leadership. He was a man with a vision to sell the property on Stafford Avenue. He also, in his vision, wanted to build a new facility with a greater ministry for the community on the 10 acres on Fall Hill Avenue. Unfortunately, he passed away before the building was completed. He died in July of 2000. This was a very sad time for the members at Arwood. The building was completed in 2002. It was renamed Riverside First Church of God, taking the First Church of God from the original name of the church. Larry Locke was the first pastor. Matt Taylor was the second one. Pastor Rick Watt was the third pastor. He stayed at Riverside for 10 years and then he retired from there. And now we have Pastor Brian Harrell.